دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah and welcome to Finding Me today on the ITV networks. A very special guest, a dynamic individual. Shabbir Banoobhai is an author, a poet, an activist, a teacher, an accountant, and I think very much more. As we get into the program, you will start to feel the essence of this great individual. It is not often that we have such a wealth of information, a storage of hope and greatness amongst us. And when we tap into that reservoir, then it is essential that we share it with the people. And so I'm very honored to have Shabbir with me today in the studio and to talk about the amazing things that he has written, but most important, to focus on his creativity. Accounting, creativity, sometimes wonders, how does this come together? But in all of that, creativity is the essence of innovation, and innovation is something that Muslims should aspire to. So with that, I'd like to say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and thank you, Shabbir, for making this time really and for coming out to be here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Quraysha. Assalamu alaikum to you and to all your listeners. I hope they find me half as interesting as you've made me out to be, but thank you.
So, you know, sometimes I think it is in the actual listening, and not just to hear, but to listen carefully, one discovers the pearls that we have or the pearls that we can offer. And I think that will come out as I chat with you, Shabbir. Shabbir, so you have written a lot. You have been inspired from a very young age. Of course, the context of South Africa, starting with apartheid, the challenges that you face there have all perhaps in a way worked their way into your writings, into your life understandings and what you're offering in your latest book, Leadership as Healing. Because I mean, from everything that I have read about you and of that which you have written, and I haven't had the opportunity to do much justice, but it is obvious that there's a political, there's a personal, there's an emotional and a spiritual context that comes into your work. Now, what I want to start with, which I think is very relevant, and it is something that maybe South Africans have or have not forgotten, is Bosnia Sarajevo. And for you, that was also a turning point. You mentioned in your blog that in 2001, you wanted to go into Bosnia, you wanted to go there, and you made it as far as the airport and you were turned back. And thereafter, you wrote a poem called Sarajevo, in fact, and for which you received the 2001 Thomas Pringle Award for Poetry. So tell us a little bit about that and about that particular poem.
My trip to Bosnia was a very unusual one. It started when a few friends, amongst them a number of doctors, decided that they'd like to go to Sarajevo to help take care of the wounded at the time of the Civil War in 1991, I think it was, that they were deciding to do this. For some reason, the doctors decided that they couldn't go. I don't remember the exact reason why, but a friend who was a journalist friend and who had been to Sarajevo previously, he decided that he would still want to go back. Right. And I got myself accredited as a journalist with a magazine, and together, both of us set off on this journey to Sarajevo, you know, one of the most dangerous places on earth at the time. And I was recovering from a heart bypass operation during this time. And
the folly of youth, right?
I went with my friend. We got as far as Zagreb. My friend said that I needed to have a bulletproof vest with me, as we would not be allowed onto the final journey from Zagreb into Sarajevo if we didn't have bulletproof vests. And he was going to buy his in Zagreb. I managed to ask my brother-in-law to look around and see if he could get a bulletproof vest. He asked someone who was a friend of it, a policeman, who lent us a bulletproof vest. And there was a guy who has a great reluctance to even harm a fly. I had a bulletproof vest in my bag, going through Frankfurt airport with all the security that it entails. Haven't a clue about Sarajevo. I hadn't been there before. I wouldn't have known how to get there on my own from Zagreb. And we arrived in Zagreb. When we got to Zagreb, we found that it was close to the Christmas period, and all the transport planes going between Zagreb and Sarajevo, carrying relief goods into Sarajevo, all of them had ceased for that particular period. In fact, it was, I think, on the eve of Christmas that I went to try to get myself or my accreditation as a journalist approved by UNPROFOR. UNPROFOR is the United Nations Protection Forces that were guarding Sarajevo at that time.
Although they never did a very good job of it.
No, they didn't. Absolutely not. In any case, when I got this accreditation approved, I was given an UNPROFOR press card, but the lady who gave it to me, because they were closing for Christmas, hand wrote it. All right, and it should have been typed. So the only difference was it should have been typed, she hand wrote it, but it was, for me, a valid press card. Somehow, a day or two later, we got onto a plane going to Sarajevo. One of the reasons I also wanted to go was that I knew the president, Alija Izetbegović, was a friend of mine, whom I had met at a conference on Muslim economic minority affairs in Sherbrooke in Canada when I was still an academic. So I wanted to go there almost as an act of support,
solidarity,
personal support,
yeah.
as well as support to the larger community. I knew nothing about Zagreb. Faisal knew where we were staying. I didn't even know where we were staying. He had the keys to the place we were staying. I didn't have any access to that place. We traveled only, I think, once from Zagreb into the place where we were staying, and all I can remember is I think we went by metro. And that's all I know.
Well, you didn't even know which metro it was.
I didn't know which one it was. As we were going, I was trying to memorize certain stops and trying to see if I could, keep some of these things in mind. But I never bothered to ask Faisal because I was with him. So
sometimes we take things for granted.
We went on, and it was a really, really cold day that we were at Zagreb airport. German transport planes had resumed their flights into Sarajevo. We stood there for many hours on the tarmac of the airport, feet practically frozen, and then we were on our way. And it took us an hour, and I think, or so, and we were in Sarajevo.
But it's there that they refused you entrance.
Yes. You get out, there's, there's sounds of gunfire everywhere. We go into a little, building. Faisal's accreditation gets checked. It's approved. He's taken onto the other side of a barrier, right? And my accreditation gets rejected because it was handwritten and not typed. And I was told that I had to go back to Sarajevo. with the same flight that I came, as soon as they had offloaded. Faisal and I barely had time to hug each other, and he was taken away and he was gone. And I had to go back to Sarajevo, to Zagreb, from Sarajevo without having a clue about how to get back to where I was and to where I was staying, not knowing the language, not knowing anybody, and with a really, really heavy bulletproof vest that was so heavy I could barely walk. And remember, I'm recovering from a heart bypass operation. In any case, we land an hour or so later in Zagreb, late at night, and I am trying to find my way back. I can't remember all the details.
So was it all of these experiences together that motivated you to now write the poem Sarajevo?
Yeah, absolutely. Just quickly to cover the rest of it. I can't remember how I got back, right? But somehow I managed to find my way back, and it's not in my, it's not something I remember. It's out of my my memory doesn't go. Maybe it refuses to
to reenact the trauma.
Yeah, to deal with that.
Yeah.
And I didn't even have a key. The day we left the apartment when we were staying, we were the only people there, right? And I didn't have a key, but when I got back late that night, there was someone else at that apartment. He fortunately let me in. I managed to phone my family, tell them what happened, and then eventually I got back home. But that motivated me to write this poem called Sarajevo.
And what is the essence of that poem?
The poem is really, for me, I completed my journey to
through the poem
Sarajevo in that poem, in which I talked about the war, I talked about the atrocities of the war, I talked about the effect on human beings, and I also questioned, the wisdom of it, and the just unbelievable stupidity of human beings who really slaughter each other, and in the most atrocious way possible.
In a publication of yours, Inward Moon, Outward Sun, 2002, there is a poem, and I'm not sure if this is the one that's Sarajevo. You say, yesterday you left the sun behind. It did not set. It simply burst like a grenade deep inside your mind. You left the mountains that you loved you would not have left, but they crumbled under the bombs meant for you. Is this part of the description of Sarajevo?
This poem is not about Sarajevo per se. So this is not the Sarajevo poem. It's another poem that takes into, that tackles our extraordinary foolishness in turning time and time again to violence. So this one, I think, covers Sarajevo, but it covers other areas as well.
Reflects the permanent state of conflict.
Right.
We have to go to a break. When we come back,
right.
I'd like to move on to the next one. We'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment today with my very special dynamic guest Shabbir Banoobhai, and we're talking literature, we're talking poetry, and we're talking about emotional, personal, political and spiritual aspects that all go into the creative ensemble of putting these thoughts onto paper. So Shabbir, before we went on to the break, you were speaking about your experiences in Sarajevo, up to the border or airport of Sarajevo, and that channeled perhaps this very emotional poem of yours, and which of course awarded you the particular award. But since then you have been writing. In total you've got now 16 books published, so you have, which includes a lot of poetry, and I see that your poetry is very, very emotional. What struck me, of course, was that before we come more into your writing, I just want to take us back to your young days of activism, and I think which is very relevant because it seems as if the clock is still turning and come full swing. You were an active student activist at UKZN, and you were part of Springfield College that you were at, right? And you were the SRC. And you write in your writings the challenges that you faced, but especially when in the 1980s when we had the boycott, and you decided to boycott as well the lectures for which you paid a price because the university then basically axed you. And it seems that this method of vindictively punishing people who want to stand up for justice in the university space is something that is continuing, because we saw it recently in the 2016 protests where student activists were targeted, specifically suspended, disciplined, etc., and prevented from coming into the university space. Retrospectively, when you stand here as you are today, looking back at 2016, the fees must fall protest, and to your days as an activist and somebody who boycotted in support of this fight for free education or for education per se, do you think that much has changed, or are we still very much, you know, standing on this plateau and looking there?
I would like to think that a lot has obviously changed, and there is still a lot, on the other hand, to change, still to change. I am by nature a person who is always forward-looking. I personally, you know, very rarely look back unless it is to find some meaning in the past or in events of the past that might help to you know, help me and help others live a better future. So the short answer would be yes, there is a lot to change, but also we have experienced a great deal of change, which we should never underestimate or not recognize.
So for you, books have always been important, and I was really thrilled by what you wrote when you were speaking about your initial encounters with books and your love for books, and then your short-sightedness, and then of course your dad's fear of you losing your eyesight. But what was really telling for me was when you, you know, you told you went up to your teacher and you said to your teacher, you know, write in my report that I must read a lot more books, because that way my dad would not stop me from reading.
Absolutely.
And then you also say that, you know, books were like an extension of your arm, and that's a beautiful, beautiful metaphor for me. What inspired you at such a young age? Because today, if you really look at it, the problem of the youth today, the problem of students also in the university and in higher education, is that students just don't want to read. And that's why Twitter, social media is actually so effective, because it's 140 or 240 characters. That's the maximum that they have to read, and they're happy with that. But you actually like fed on books.
Very, very much so. I totally grew up on books. An advantage I had in my own development, which most people might not consider to be an advantage, but my parents only spoke to us in Urdu, so all my English came from books, which possibly helped me to gain a stronger command of the language without it being affected by, you know, how my parents might have spoken had they attempted to speak in English and didn't do so very well. Where this love comes from is a really good question. I am not totally certain. It could be a teacher when I was very young who might have inspired me. I would like to think so.
So they definitely are a fortress of goodness, you know, especially when you tap into that. And a good teacher always, without a doubt, leaves a footprint that one always latches onto. I think, you know, from your publications, these include the Book of Songs in 2004. if I could write Ramadan letters 2006, and that was that you wrote mostly to your daughters, right?
That's right.
To Ilham and Tazkiyah,
Yeah.
and then Water Would Suffice, Reflections of Love 2007, and A Mountain is an Upside Down Valley, a very, very, and again, a very nice metaphor if one really thinks about it, 2008. So a lot of these focus on love, on personal experiences, on sharing wisdom, emotion. What has been for you, going through 2004, 2006, 2007, 2008, what was the tide that you were riding, and what was the most important driving force that led to these ideas?
Just a quick comment on the title, Mountain is an Upside Down Valley. I think as human beings, we very often forget the importance and the power of paradox in our lives. So if we only focus on construction, we forget the need for destruction sometimes that needs to happen before we can reconstruct ourselves, right. You know, or, you know, there is a need for us to be both knowledgeable and innocent and naive, because that is again the only way in which to know the world comprehensively, know it almost as a scientist and as well as an artist. So paradox is a very important, neglected aspects of our lives, so the understanding of it is a very neglected thing. My work, I would say, and particularly my early work, had three core elements to it. One was a very strong and not always completely recognized political social element. The reason why it's not so recognizable to many people is the fact that I wrap it in a spiritual wrapping. The reason why I did so is that my earliest mentor, South Africa's greatest poet at that time, and maybe of even to this day, I'm quite happy to acknowledge him in this light. You know, I loved him, and I was very fond of me. He said
You're speaking
to me,
about Livingston now.
Sorry?
You're speaking about Livingston?
Yes, Douglas Livingston. I might have said David, but Douglas Livingston. Douglas taught me that poetry is something that is a constructed thing. It is, and art itself is something that is actually constructed. And, you know, so I began to see it in the light of doing work on it, being, you know, working on art, and not just expecting your first, you know, flows that may not be very good to be the ultimate product that should stem from your energy. Coming to why the wrapping, in a sense. In fact, it's more than a wrapping. I would say it's also the essence, because it's far more than a wrapping. It is the essence that has to relate to the real world as well as to the inner world. So it cannot be an essence that only relates to the inner without having a transformative effect on the outer, which again has a further transforming effect on the inner. So we tried to avoid this problem that was very evidently coming into being of too much protest and too little poetry, as it were. Okay. So we wanted, you know, Douglas said to me, Shabbir, a good poet is someone who's been dead for 100 years and one of his poems is still read.
Okay, but I have to stop you there. We're going to come back for a second interview. I would just like you to conclude the segment for us with perhaps one or two of the lines that still is refreshingly familiar for you after all of these years, so that we can carry forward onto the next one.
قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين، فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء، إنه الإسلام نور وضياء.
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم